Hey, welcome to our deep dive today. Um, as a recent grad, you're probably thinking about all the equipment you need to get started,
Hmm.
right? And one of the biggest is a good curing light. We want to make sure you're getting one that, really delivers what it promises for the best, results for your patients.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a big investment, and there are so many options out there.
That can be.
Yeah, it's a little overwhelming, to be honest.
I hear you. That's why we dug into this study about curing light consistency. It's pretty eye-opening. They actually tested a huge number of lights,
Mm.
278 to be exact,
Yeah.
all Bluephase style, which I'm sure you've heard of.
Oh, yeah, Bluephase is a popular one. But honestly, I just always assumed all curing lights were pretty much the same?
Right. Well, and that's where it gets interesting. There's actually an international standard that allows for some variation in a light's output, but it's pretty broad. So this research is super valuable because it looked at how consistent these lights actually are in the real world.
Okay, so what did they find? Were the Bluephase lights all over the place?
Not at all. Yeah. And that's the great news. They use some pretty advanced equipment to precisely measure both the power of the light, the intensity, and the emission spectrum. So that's the specific type of light that's actually, hardening the resin.
Okay.
Turns out all 278 of those Bluephase style lights delivered an average power very close to what the manufacturer claimed, which is 1,200 milliwatts per centimeter squared.
Okay.
Even the lowest and highest outputs were within a really tight range.
Wow, that's reassuring.
It is, especially when you consider that the acceptable range, according to that international standard, is plus or minus 20%.
Oh, wow.
These blue phase lights were way more consistent than that.
So that means I could be confident that I'm getting what I'm paying for with a Bluephase?
Based on this study, it seems that way. They delivered on their claims. But there's one more thing they looked at that I think is interesting, especially for someone just starting out. They also examined how that emission spectrum changed over the 6 years the lights were purchased. So from 2017 to 2022.
So, like, does the type of light coming out change as the light gets older?
Exactly. Now, they did find some small differences, probably because of the way LEDs are sorted by their characteristics. There could be slight variations even in the same model.
Hmm. Is that something to be worried about?
Well, that's what we're going to unpack in the next part of our deep dive because this research focused on brand new lights, you know, right out of the box. But what about after they've been used for a while? Stick with us and we'll dive into the long-term performance of these lights, which is something I know you'll want to hear about before making a purchase.
Okay, so we left off talking about how those blue phase lights performed when they were brand new. But what about after they've been used for a while? That's what I'm really curious about.
Exactly. You're not going to be buying a brand new light every year.
Right.
Right, so you want something that's going to last. Well, good news. The researchers actually looked into this too. They took those same 278 Bluephase style lights and tested them again after 2 years of use, both in preclinical settings, like a lab, and in actual clinical settings, being used by dental students.
Oh, wow. So real world wear and tear, not just sitting in a box. That's great. Did the light output drop off after all that use?
Well, they used two different measuring devices to check the output, which is a smart way to make sure the readings are accurate. And the results were really encouraging. They found some differences between the measurements when the lights were brand new and after those 2 years, but the power output was still really close to those initial readings.
That's a relief. So how close were the numbers?
For example, when they used one of the meters, the average power was about 1,152 milliwatts per centimeter squared after 2 years.
Hmm.
And if you remember, the average for the brand new lights was about 1,197. So pretty darn close.
Yeah.
The ranges they measured were a bit wider after 2 years. But still, considering they've been used extensively, the consistency is impressive.
Wow. So even after 2 years of use, they're pretty much holding steady. That's a good sign for durability.
Absolutely. And I think that's a big takeaway for you as you're shopping for a curing light. It seems like the blue phase style light really does hold up over time, which is what you want.
Mm.
But of course, we always have to think critically about these studies, right?
Right. Like what?
Well, for one, this was just one model of curing light. So while the results are promising for blue phase, it doesn't necessarily mean all curing lights will perform the same way.
Good point. And I guess we don't know what happens after even longer periods of use, like 5 years or 10 years.
Exactly. This study only looked at 2 years. But it definitely suggests that, the blue phase style is a workhorse
Mm.
and maintains its consistency over time. It doesn't mean you can completely forget about it, though. Regular maintenance is still key, like keeping the light guide clean and checking the output periodically with a meter.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've talked about choosing a light and how it performs over time. Is there anything else I should be thinking about?
There's one more piece of the puzzle, and it's actually the most important part, your technique. Because even the best curing light in the world won't do the job if you're not using it correctly. All right, so we've talked about choosing a curing light and then, making sure it's going to be reliable over time. But now let's talk about you. Because even with the most consistent curing light, your technique can really make all the difference.
Yeah, I remember from dental school, technique is super important, but it would be great to hear what I should be paying attention to now that I'm actually out in practice.
You got it. I think the biggest pitfall, and I see this all the time, is just not curing for long enough.
Mm.
I know we're all busy, and it can be tempting to shave off a few seconds here and there, but it can really compromise your results.
Okay, so what happens if you don't cure the resin for long enough?
Well, if that resin doesn't get enough light energy, it won't fully harden. It's called polymerization, and that can mean, weaker bonds, more gaps around the edges of the filling, and even restorations that just don't last as long.
That makes sense. So how do I make sure I'm curing for the right amount of time? Just the manufacturer instructions.
Those are a good starting point, but there's a little more to it. Things like the shade of composite you're using, how thick it is, and even the type of curing light you have can all play a role.
Yeah, so a darker shade or a thicker layer might need a longer curing time.
Exactly. It's always better to err on the side of curing a little longer than not long enough.
Good to know. Anything else I should be watching out for?
Positioning is also key. You want the light as close to the tooth as possible,
Yeah.
ideally touching it. And at a right angle,
Hmm.
if you hold it too far away or at an angle, the light's not going to be as effective.
Okay, so consistent contact, right angle. Got it.
Yep.
What about movement? Does that matter?
Absolutely. Keep that light steady. Any movement during curing can kind of mess up the light beam and cause uneven hardening.
Okay, so no waving it around like a magic wand.
Yeah.
Anything else on technique, or are we good?
Just one more thing, and it's back to maintenance. Keeping that light guide clean is super important. Any smudges or debris or even scratches can really reduce how much light gets through.
Okay, so consistent light output, proper technique, and keep it clean. I feel like I'm ready to conquer the world of curing.
That's the spirit. Remember, this whole deep dive was about empowering you to make the best choices for your practice and your patients. So as you're shopping for your curing light, think about these factors we discussed. And once you've got it, don't forget about those technique tips. They'll make a world of difference. Happy curing.